Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. This is one in a series of many collaborative efforts between Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church lecture series, as well as the Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate here in Tampa Bay. We've done many events on various topics that relate to our church and our history, and especially those that touch on the subject of religious freedom. Tonight, we're very excited to have with us a noted Archon and professor, Dr. Papademetriou, to give us a special presentation on the Ecumenical Patriarchate under the Ottomans. Now, you know, when most of us learn Greek history, we learn about the glorious classical period, which lasted a few hundred years. And then we fell under the Romans, and et cetera, we cultured them, they conquered us, that kind of thing. And then we hear about the Byzantine period, and it's kind of not given so much emphasis as the classical, but that lasted for 1,000 years plus, a Christian empire that was Greek culturally. And then we lost Constantinople and the empire to the Turks. And that becomes like this black box that we don't hear of anything happening for 400 years, except for we were slaves or something to that effect. And then, of course, then there's the glorious revolution of 1821, and Greek history starts again. But there's that dark period, that, almost like the Dark Ages that we refer to, that not too many people learn about, that is exactly what our speaker is an expert in. And so we're going to be very honored and excited to have him give us the subject tonight. But before we begin, I would like to call to the podium our past Vicar Emeritus, Father James Matheos, to give an opening prayer.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus Christ, our God, whose birth we are about to celebrate, and the peace that you bring to the world, we ask that that peace continue to permeate this world. In the troubled areas, in our own patriarchate, in our own country, may that peace be with us all the days of our lives. May that peace also be with our speaker, with the Archons of the Patriarchate, with this Holy Trinity Church, and with all of us. May it permeate our hearts, and make Christmas a year-round celebration. Amen.
For those of you who don't know, Father Matheos was our main pastor, or Aristomenes, for 21 years, before retiring 3 or 4 times. And now he has a name for encouragement, so we're so honored and blessed to have him back with us again tonight. Now I'd like to call to the podium our current Aristomenes, Father James Paris, for some welcoming remarks and a special presentation, as today is November 30th, which is the feast day of St. Andrew, who is the patron saint of the Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate.
Thank you, Ted. I sent out 2 articles on the Archons and also on St. Andrew, the first called Disciple, so you can read those, and I shall be concise. It brings me great joy to have a good man and a good friend, Dr. Professor Tom Papademetriou with us today. And I honestly didn't know what your title was. Archon Didascalos Tuianos, the princely teacher of the race, the Christian race, huh? That's fantastic. That's beautiful. Tom and I went to school together at the seminary at Holy Cross, and his father and my father were classmates and graduates of Holy Cross Seminary and spent many years in the ministry. And they always had a fond affection for one another, and praise the Lord, your father is still alive and doing well. And Tom heralds from a very beautiful family of educated people. And his beautiful mom, Presbytero, I remember fondly at Holy Cross every time I went to the library. And your dad, always seeing him. So this means a lot to me that you are here. Thank you for coming. And as you know, another one of our graduates of Holy Cross, the word I got today is that he will be the new president of Illinois College Holy Cross, Demetrius Katos, a fellow scholar and friend of yours, who went to Catholic University and has got his PhD in early Christian studies, and hopefully we'll bring him here, as well as Dr. Petitsis and all of our friends. So it's great to see you and great to have you, and we look forward to your wonderful lecture coming up. God bless you.
For anyone who hasn't come to one of our presentations before, let me just tell you a little bit about the Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. We are an organization in this country, in the Order of St. Andrew, of about 700 individuals who have been chosen for their leadership and their activity in the church, and their special commitment to support and defend the Ecumenical Patriarchate as the United States oaths go against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that actually, unfortunately, turns to be more people than we would like to admit. The Patriarchate has always been under duress since 1453 and continues to be today in 2023. And the Archons are there to support him, to protect him, to make sure that he's able to continue to function in Constantinople where he belongs. And we have various issues that we work with in international forums that have a direct impact on our religious freedom as Greek Orthodox Americans. So we're very proud to be able to co-host this event tonight with one of our own, Archon of Tampa Bay. I love that title as well. That's great. Dr. Papademetriou is the Constantine and Georgine Georgiou Endowed Professor of Greek History and the Director of the Dean and Zoe Pappas Interdisciplinary Center for Hellenic Studies of Stockton University. He's a graduate of Hellenic College in 1988 and Holy Cross School of Theology in 1992. Dr. Papademetriou received his PhD from Princeton University's Department of Near Eastern Studies in Ottoman history. How many Greeks major in Ottoman history? That's great. Conducting research in the Ottoman archives, the archives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Istanbul, and in the Center for Asia Minor Studies in Athens, he focuses on the history of non-Muslims under Ottoman rule, especially the relations of the Greek Orthodox Church and state in the early Ottoman centuries, which is the subject of his book, Render unto the Sultan, published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Papademetriou has been awarded several research fellowships, including the prestigious Dumbarton Oaks Byzantine Research Center at Harvard University, and the Edward and Elizabeth Whitehead Member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He has served as president of the Modern Greek Studies Association and was invested as Archon Didaskalos Eugenos of the Archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate by His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in 2021. He lives in Linwood, New Jersey with his wife Dory, who directs Mud Girls Studios, a non-profit organization assisting women in poverty. It is my great honor to introduce to you my friend, my fellow Archon, and a wonderful, wonderful person, as well as an expert in all of this, Dr. Papademetriou.
So, thank you. Regional Commander Ted Lacos, a good friend, Reverend Fathers, esteemed Archons, ladies and gentlemen, really this is an honor to be with you. I have my old friend and painting lost, Carrigatou, you're sitting there, so I'm glad you showed up. So I'm among friends, I feel like. First, I'd like to say Konya Pola on this feast day of St. Andrew. We've discussed having this event on this day because it's the thronal feast of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And so, thank you for the hospitality. I also wanted to thank Lisa and for the hospitality and hosting, as well as Maria Papademetriou last evening, Matheos' mother, and Matheos is a good friend. We've traveled to Asia Minor many times, so I just wanted to, again, to tell you how pleased I am to be here. So, because I'm speaking about the Ecumenical Patriarchate, I want to first acknowledge His All Holiness, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. I had the great honor of being elevated to Archon Didaskalos Reganos from his hand in 2021 in New York, and I hope to live up to the great title I received from his blessed hand. On the west wall of the entrance of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople in the Thanar is a marvelous mosaic of St. Andrew, the first called apostle, and Stachys, the first bishop of the city of Byzantium that later became Constantinople. And some of you may have seen this mosaic on your pilgrimages there. Now, in the same entryway, on the very opposite wall, is another stunning mosaic featuring two figures in classic Byzantine style. Patriarch Gennadios Scholarios, the first patriarch invested following the conquest of the city in 1453, and the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. This modern mosaic shows Sultan Mehmed standing face to face with the patriarch Gennadios, holding a document that promises to Patriarch Gennadios all the privileges of preceding patriarchs. Many of us have seen this mosaic and know this episode well. It's a critical episode in the survival of the Ecumenical Patriarchate during the Ottoman period. Now, according to Islamic law, when a city is conquered, and in this case, the city of Constantinople was conquered on May 29, 1453, it meant that all who resisted, all the resisting fighters, inhabitants, everybody was enslaved. And so we have evidence that Patriarch Gennadios had been taken as a slave and was ransomed. Now, for this Christian city, it also meant that the churches would be taken over, some being destroyed, others turned into residences, and others turned into mosques. And of course, the most famous being the Hagia Sophia. That was the first place where Sultan Mehmed II went when he conquered the city. And the sources reveal how he marveled at this church, and he also walked on the dome. He was that intrigued by it, as we all are. So, according to Islamic law, there was no expectation that Christians of the city and the Ecumenical Patriarchate should survive. Yet it did. And of course, we deem this a miracle and an act of God preserving our church. Now, what is interesting about this powerful mosaic is that it was commissioned in the 1980s, and I remember going as a young student, the first time in 1989, the scaffolding of this building that had burnt down in the 30s and 40s, I believe, and it was still being resurrected, and I walked through and saw this as it had just been put up in 1989. And I was amazed at that time, because what I thought about this was it's a political statement. The Patriarchate has its origins with St. Andrew and Stachys, but it's confirmed, and its place in the city is confirmed by this very powerful mosaic. So it continues to be a resident in the city, and of course it's the mission of the Archons to ensure that it continues into the future. Yet, this image poses some problems for us as historians, because when we look at it, this becomes the marker of what the relationship should be, right? The height, the pinnacle of Mehmed, the conqueror, respecting Patriarch and giving him pronomia, all the privileges. And so it becomes, let's say, a snapshot moment that oftentimes is referred to as where the patriarch is granted the right to be head of the community, invested with the power to be the representative of the Greek Orthodox people to the state. That doesn't happen. It appears that way, we want to think of it that way, but in fact the historical record doesn't doesn't display that. And so what I'm going to do tonight is give you a sense of the long range of this experience. What we have to think about is 1453 is 150 years after the Ottomans show up on the scene, and it's almost 300 some years after the Turks first show up on the scene. So we have to think about the period right prior to this, and then also what happens after. So in order to kind of give a sense, one of the things I realized when I had been working on this, that there are no good periodizations. Now when we do periodizations, we want to think about what are the trends over a period of time. And so I've come up with essentially 6 periods, and I'm going to go through this fairly rapidly, I hope. But the first period is one of Byzantine decline and collapse. And we see this from 1299 to 1453. This is that 150-year period, which is very important in the relationships between the Turkmen tribes, including the Ottomans, and the Patriarchate, the bishops. The second is from 1453 to 1517, which includes from the shock of losing the city, to recovery. And this is a very difficult period of time. From 1517 to about 1600 is a period of rebuilding, rebuilding the great Church of Christ. And then from 1600, for the next century or so, it's about consolidating and defending the power of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, as well as reacting to Western encroachments, the Protestant missionaries, the Catholic missionaries. By the 1700s, the Ecumenical Patriarchate is at the peak of its power as an institution. We always think of this period as the Dark Ages, but in fact, the Patriarchate is as strongest as it's leading into the period right before the Greek Revolution, right before 1820. It's at the peak of its authority over the entire Mediterranean Greek Orthodox community. And so, of course, that's short-lived. That's between 1821 and 1923, which is the end of the empire. We call this a period of revolutions, reform, reconfigurations, and this ultimately is a great dismantling of the authority and jurisdictions of the Patriarchate to being essentially the city of Constantinople, the islands of Tenedos and Igos. Of course, we know it's a much broader story from the standpoint of the Treaty of Lausanne and how it understood the story. So, I'm going to kind of go through these things fairly quickly. I'm going to try and gloss them. There's a lot of details, and what I said before was, in order to understand kind of where the Ottomans came from, we have to think about the original loss of Asia Minor. And in this case, we see, this is a miniature of an Ottoman Turkmen tribesman, and they are great cavalry on horseback with bow and arrow. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 is a major event that opens the floodgates for the Turkmen advances into Asia Minor. And they set up an empire known as the Seljuk Sultanate. Now, that coupled with the Fourth Crusade weakens the Byzantine Church to the point where when the Ottomans are established, we see this little spot here is called Osman. That's where the Ottomans originate. It's in Bithynia. The city of Prusa is there. It's near Nicaea, Iznik. It's just in this northwestern corner. And one of the advantages they had was that they were next to an enemy state that was very weak. So from the point of view of this tribal group, they had incursions, raids against the Byzantines and were very successful. And in doing so, they advanced, they crossed into the European side, and essentially, over time, became a larger empire. Now, we have very few sources of the early Ottomans, even from Turkish sources. The sources that the Ottoman and the Turkish sources really begin to show up in the early 1400s, so 100 years afterwards. But one of the important sources that we have that's earlier is a Greek source from none other than St. Gregory Palamas. I don't know if you know where he was Archbishop of Thessaloniki. He was and here's an icon of him. And he reigned as Archbishop for these years. He was the champion of hesychasm, right? Hesychasmos, the Jesus prayer. This whole experience of the spiritual element of the uncreated light and experiencing that. So he was captured in 1354. He was traveling from Tenedos. He was on a boat, and the Ottomans they were close to shore. There was a storm, and the Ottomans captured him. They take him prisoner, and they bring him ashore to near Gallipoli, and on the Asian side, they go to a town called Biga, and he is taken to be ransomed. He's not meant to be enslaved. So when they take him, they bring him to one city, Biga, and then to Prusa, and then ultimately the Christians ransom him. When he's first captured, the Christians say, "This is incredible. Gregory Palamas shows up." They're so excited, right? And he's like, "Please don't get excited because the cost of the ransom is going to go up." We know all this because he writes a letter detailing the entire account. Now, one of the interesting things he does is in each of the places he's kind of taken, in the first instance, we see the grandson of the great emir, Orhan, right, his grandson Ismail, who was a known enemy of the Christians, he and the archbishop have a picnic together. They sit, they're talking, and Palamas is not eating any meat, and so they begin to talk about, well, they begin to talk about why are you eating meat? Why are you fasting? And so from that, they start to discuss the differences between Islam and Christianity. In fact, then they find out that the emir wants to have his theologians speak to Gregory in a formal discussion and debate. And so they have a debate about about Islam and Christianity. And Gregory is unafraid to speak. And then the final one is, as he's in a small village, he sees an Islamic funeral, and he goes over to talk to the folks. And he ends up talking to the imam, and they talk about what the funeral rite is. And Gregory's a religious person, so he's curious, and he has this engagement. But what's interesting, we learn a few things. We learn that, first and foremost, that even though the Ottomans are in charge, there are Christians who still have their churches. There are Christians who still are able to have their communities. They might be under duress, but the people who are looking after Gregory Palamas is a man named Matheos, right? He was a kind of leader of the community. And the physician of Emir is Tabonitis, another Greek individual. So the Greek kind of element within the early Ottoman scene is there. And in fact, they are present even to much of the chagrin of many of those who are from Greek Orthodox background. They're even in some of the conquests. They even join in, but remain as Christians. Even we have evidence of that up to the 1500s, which is kind of surprising. So the expansion of the empire up until, let's say, 1413 is in this red area. And what you should know is that it first begins in Romania, in the Balkans, and then they come back into Anatolia. So when we think about the Ottomans, they're a minority demographic group. They're smaller in number than the people they're conquering. And so they have to think about ways in which they're going to engage and co-opt the leadership in those places. And this is one of their projects. So what happens when the Ottomans meet bishops? Now this is a little bit more difficult because the bishops during the late Byzantine era had been granted extra authority by the state. The state had kind of receded. It had lost its authority, and what they said to the bishops is, you act as judges. You act as the civil authority in your region. So the Byzantine state gave them more authority because their own people had to retreat in a sense. So we have 26 acta, which are the patriarchal minutes of the synod, that talk about Turks, right, within the period that we're talking about. What they reveal is discord and oppressive violence, right? So this is clear. The minutes are from the point of view of the Patriarchate, and what they're seeing is problematic. It's violent, and people are forced to leave. Now, what were the options for the bishops? They actually have three. One is that they can flee and leave, go to Constantinople, right? I'm not going to stick around and be captured, right? Or they're taken captive for ransom. I'm not sticking around, I'm going to Constantinople. The second option is to be assigned a different location, to be reassigned to a more friendly region so that they continue to function out in the provinces, but not necessarily under the Ottomans. The third, though, which is the Patriarchate at the time when they're writing these things, sees this as problematic. They accept to stay under direct rule of the Turkish emirs. And in so doing, they have to give a payment. They have, in order to stay in their see, to stay in their bishopric, they have to pay. Right? That's a privilege, it's protection money, if you will. Right? And so from that point of view, the Patriarchate, when they're seeing these stories, some of them are leaving, some of them are fleeing, some of them are being reassigned, but a number of them are staying with their flock. And the Patriarchate doesn't necessarily like it because they are now independent and acting under a different foreign authority, and they have their position thanks to this Muslim authority. So it becomes problematic from the point of view of the Patriarchate. So those of you who love to deal with taxes and finances, which is probably very few of you, the next couple of slides are I'm going to try and gloss, but they are important. Because when I said they had to pay protection protection money becomes something that's a gift, it becomes institutionalized. And the term that is kind of, in order to have your position as a bishop, you have to give a gift. It's not a donation, it's not a free will thing, you have to give it. And so this peshkesh, originally, is so that they can remain free and in their place, but it later becomes institutionalized. And so this notion of peshkesh, this investiture gift, is something that isn't unique just to the bishops. It's every Ottoman official. If you're going to be an Ottoman official, a governor, or anything anywhere around, you're going to still also pay this same peshkesh. Right? So the gift giving, and that becomes institutionalized. It's expected. It happens all the way to the 1850s. Right? So from this earliest period, which is pre-1453, all the way to that time. And of course, it becomes standard practice. Bishops, metropolitans, and patriarchs all have to do this. Okay. So this then brings up the second part of the cash payments. You need to give an investiture gift, but guess what? Every church, every metropolis, every bishopric has an income stream. We know that here. You have different sources of income. You have your stewardship, you get money from your candles, your festival, all of these things, now to some degree more or less existed in these early times as well. People donated property with vineyards on them, fields to be cultivated, stores that had rent. So churches, and especially metropolises, had income streams. So the problem for the Ottomans was they could not just tax those, because those were deemed, they didn't recognize in Islamic law a corporate nature of the institution of the church. So what they did instead was, if you want to be patriarch, if you want to be bishop, you're going to give an investiture gift, yes, but every year you're going to give what's known as the Papademetriou, the patriarchal tax, the Metropolitic Rusumu. There's another tax every year, and it was to be paid on the day of St. George, right? April 23rd, or when it's celebrated after Easter. So the issue was that they could not exploit the resources of the church, but it was so that they could do this, they create the patriarch, and they make him what is known as a tax farmer. The term is used as multezi, it's an Ottoman term. And they consider the church to be a tax farm, which is iltizam. And so every year the patriarch and the metropolitans, they all pay this. Now, when they pay their amounts to the sultan, whatever they pay, and anything extra that is garnered, stays with them as a patriarch and with the church. So the collection, of course, they're hoping to have good collections, pay what they need to, and then keep the remainder. Now, of course, this in a period where there's not a lot of oversight, and there's not a lot of kind of oversight, leads to what we call financial scandals and charges of office buying. The word simony is a term where you buy your office. And so this becomes a practice, and I'll talk about it in a couple minutes, a little bit more carefully. So the conclusion for this little section that I'm talking about now, and this is the financial story, is that the Ottomans treat the Patriarchate as economic functionaries in this tax collecting system, and that the church was an economic resource to exploit. It was a tax farm, and it functions like any other tax farm. And in fact, this is something when I was doing my research, I found that the person who governs the port of Istanbul or of Smyrna or other places has the same responsibility. They are tax farmers in the same way. So these are concessions. These are so this economic system. I know when I talk about this, my wife, her eyes glaze over, and I'm kind of starting to see a little bit of you, and I'm not going to keep you too long on this. But this is essentially what the Ottomans think about. This is how they approach things. Now, moving on to our next period is the period of shock and recovery. And so the extreme impoverishment, the lack of authority of the Patriarchate of Constantinople was evident prior to 1453. And of course, after the city was conquered, the remaining residents, including the clergy, monks, and nuns, either were killed or were taken prisoner to be ransomed or sold as slaves. And the state of the church was in complete disarray. The leadership of the church had fled. In fact, the previous patriarch, Patriarch Joseph, had been absent a year prior to 1453. Here are the famous walls, and of course the canon that was created by a Hungarian canon maker who tried to go to the Byzantines and say, do you want this canon? And they said, no, we have walls, don't worry, Panagia will save us. And he goes to the Ottomans and sells it to them. And of course they manufacture it close to the area. So as the dust settles, the dust of 1453 settles, Sultan Mehmed turns his attention to rebuilding the city. He was a very interesting man. He was raised learning Greek. His mother, his stepmother, was Mara Brankovic, a Byzantine princess, and he was very close to her. And she also becomes a patron of the church at an important period of time. But he wants to rebuild the city to be this grand place. Of course, Hagia Sophia becomes a mosque, but he needs Greeks, Armenians, and Jews to do the skilled labor, all the things that you need to have an imperial city. The Turkmen, who are used to being on the field and fighting, are not capable. In fact, Mehmet restricts them from coming into the city. He doesn't want them to be. Certain people he'll allow that are part of his group, but he allows the Greeks. And one of the reasons why he calls for Patriarch Gennadios is in January of 1454, he calls him to be Patriarch because he wants to ensure the Greeks, assure them that it's safe. If they have their patriarchs in office, it's safe to return. So some were ransomed and they come back. Others who had fled are now being invited back, especially craftsmen, builders, right? All the people that can do the important work for Mecca. So we have a contemporary account. One of his secretaries is a man named Clearwater from the island of Imros. And Clearwater was a Greek secretary in Sultan Mehmed's court, and he gives a description of Mehmed meeting Patriarch Gennadios. And I'll read this because I think it's interesting for all of us. In the end, he, the Sultan, made the patriarch and high priest. He gave him, among many other rights and privileges, the rule of the church and all its power and authority, no less than that enjoyed previously under the emperors. He also granted him the privilege of delivering before him fearlessly and freely many good disquisitions concerning the Christian faith and doctrine. And he himself went to his residence, taking with him the dignitaries and wise men of his court, and thus paid him great honor. Furthermore, the Sultan gave back the church to the Christians by the will of God, together with a large portion of its properties. So we have this account. It's a contemporary account, and it's a truthful account because the church does get back churches, right? Hagia Sophia is gone. It's the biggest conquest it's going to take back, but the other churches. So we have the Patriarchate showing up at the Church of the Holy Apostles as the next Patriarchate. I'll give you a list of those Patriarchates. So this is a manuscript that describes the history. Now, the question, of course, is what is this document that he's giving him? And so that was something I was trying to figure out. It doesn't exist. But we have documents earlier for metropolitans, and we have later ones for other patriarchs. And so, lo and behold, a berat, a patriarchal, a document coming from the Sultan's hand, describes to the patriarch, right? And it describes it as a multezim. It's Patriarch Simeon in 1483. And so it's a copy of its sultanic decree. The imperial command, the auspicious edict, may God implement it until the day of the resurrection, orders the holder of the honorable imperial sign, Simeon, is appointed as the tax farmer in Istanbul. And the condition he paid 2,000 florins in every Christian feast. Right? And these are the areas. It talks about Iraklia, Tekrida, which is Silivria, Andrianoupoli, Sozopoulis, Achiolum, Varna, Filippoupoli, all these places. You can see all the locations, including down here, Limnos, Imbros, Chios, Kriti, Rhodos, other places. So these are the types of documents. We don't have the one that Mehmed gave to Gennadios, but this comes a few years later. It shows him with the economic responsibility. So there are a couple of other things. They do not want unbelievers, meaning Christians, to be converted by force, right? And that they shall hold the church called Pamakarisos, and the churches in Ayuyanis. So by that time, the Patriarchate had moved a couple spots. Again, I'll show you those in a minute. Now, this source is a 16th century history of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And in it, it describes scandals. If you read this, you're like horrified. Because it really is. It's very upsetting. I read it as a college student, and this is one of the reasons I was curious about this, and I continued my curiosity into graduate school. Patriarch Yoasaph is so troubled by the scandals that he jumps in a well to try and kill himself. He's hurt by some people and he's rescued, and of course he's saved eternal damnation, but he was so despondent. There's a conflict between Marcos Silocaravis and Patriarch Simeon of Trebizond, who's there we saw, and there's kind of who should be patriarch, and they have competition between who's going to give more of a gift to the Sultan and who should have the position. Patriarch Dionysios, he was the candidate of the stepmother of Mehmet, of Mara Brankovic. She wants him in charge. He's actually deemed to be a holy man, a saint of the church, Saint Dionysius. And so, in his case, it was kind of an odd thing. His opponents were charging that he had become Muslim, because possibly that. And so, I know this is a little off color, but it says, in order to prove he wasn't a Muslim, he had to pull up his robes and show that he was uncircumcised, which is one of the things. So it's a horrible situation. And then the other one is a Serbian patriarch, Raphael, who, because he was a Serbian and he didn't like Greek and he didn't know Greek well, he didn't have support in order to raise enough money. He couldn't pay the yearly fee, and he was thrown in debtor's prison. So these are things that are happening in the immediate aftermath. So we have this notion of what are these scandals about? Oftentimes they're being charged with simony, with paying the officer. But of course, it ties back to what we said before. They are the investiture gift and the yearly tax that they are supposed to have. So in this period, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople experienced its greatest existential crisis and was at its weakest point as it struggled with an oppressive state and with unscrupulous lay people and even clergy. So a very dark period for the church. Now, how do we go from that to the next stage? During the next period, there are a couple major shifts that happen in the Ottoman context. There we have the conquest of the entire Middle East, as well as the figure of Suleiman the Magnificent. Some of you may have heard his name. There was a big exhibition like 35 years ago, but it traveled and it was, but he's well known as being a significant figure, but also a reconciler of Islamic law with Ottoman law. So the question is, what challenges did the Patriarchate face trying to rebuild the great Church of Christ? Now, the same manuscript that was giving all the other things told an interesting story. It said when Suleiman became Sultan, his father had just conquered the Middle East and became the master of Mecca and Medina. A very Islamic kind of change came over the empire. And so from that, Suleiman wanted to prove his own kind of Islamic, bona fides. And so he began a process of trying to take over Christian churches. The Greek story says, at that time, there were members from the Ottoman court who were friends with people of the Patriarchate and said, they want to take your churches. They called Patriarch Theodosius. Oops, I'm not ready to wrap up, so. There we go. Let me see if I can. Okay. They were not ready to. They were not. Sorry, Theodosius is being told they're going to take your churches. They're trying to figure out how can we save our churches. And so he ends up kind of showing up at the Sultan's court. He's told this command. He goes back, and then they hatch a plan amongst themselves. A short while later, they go back to the Sultan's court. This time, they are accompanied by 3 janissaries. I don't know if you know who janissaries are. Janitsari. They are formerly Christians who are taken into the Sultan's service, forcibly converted to Muslim, but now they're serving the Sultan. As they were children between 12 and 18. Well, there were 3 aged Janissaries. They must have been in their 90s. And they brought them, and they said, we have proof that Constantinople was not conquered. It was given over. The keys of the city were given. And the Sultan says, no, that's impossible. And the Sheikh al-Islam is like, that's not true. We know that it was conquered. They said, no, these 3 sources, right, these witnesses were there when the conquest happened. They say dutifully, yes, we were there. We saw the emperor give the keys over to Sultan Mehmed, and therefore the city was not conquered. Now, this is a problem for these people, because they have 3 Muslim sources, witnesses, and they have to take the evidence as true. This is part of the Islamic law. So, the Sheikh al-Islam is trying to figure out what this is about. And they come up with this, and if you go in the Ottoman sources, he writes a whole fatwa specifically on this. He says, yes, the story of the conquest, but we know it was conquered, but there are cases within the entire city that some of the neighborhoods came out and gave the key to and welcomed the conquerors in. So they kind of fudged it in the Islamic fatwa because they had to. The Islamic witnesses were like saying this. So in that case, they were able to save their churches. And so Theodokos couldn't find the document, but he says these are witnesses. So here we have another story of the church responding to the challenge and coming up with a creative way. One of the things about the Janissaries is they know who they are. They're 12 and 18. Some of them have and they're connected to their Christian family or their Christian friends. Some of them become enemies, but in many of them they're there. So this is why we think that will be the case. So thinking about the locations of the Patriarchate, we know that Hagia Sophia is the great church of Christ. It is the patriarchal church. And again, that's why when we see the church turned into a mosque most recently, it's a bit horrifying, but here we are. The next location for 3 years was the Church of Holy Apostles, and that only ceased to be the case because it was in a dangerous area. They found a dead body in the courtyard, and they said, we need to get out of here. So then it moves to a place called the Papademetriou, which is up the hill from the current Patriarchate. It moves again to Theotokos, Papademetriou, and then Matheos, and then by 1601 is where it's at its current place. And so if we look at the locations, here's the first spot here. The second one is the Holy Apostles, and then the third is Papademetriou. Fourth is, I think, Demetrios, and then Kanavu's here, and then finally 6 is St. George. So it ends up in this area on the Golden Horn. And here are some of the images. This is a manuscript. This church doesn't exist. Mehmed built his own mosque. The Mosque of the Conqueror is on the church. And it's said that he did this because Constantine had his own tomb in this church. And he wanted it to be the continuity. He saw himself as a continuator of Constantine himself, as a Caesar. The Papademetriou, which it looks similar to the Kadei Zami, but it's a different church. And we have 16th century travelers giving their manuscript a few. This is the church of Theotokos Papademetriou. It's in the Fanar. And then, of course, Demetrios, another, and St. George, which we all recognize. So, this was from 1601 to the present. So, just to kind of move on, the question, of course, is how much authority do you have as a patriarch? And we see in this 16th century block print the metropolitans. Metropolitans, they show up in the Ottoman sources. I was really shocked. They show up because the patriarch is going to the Sultan and saying, I'm supposed to pay you a yearly patrik rusumum, but my metropolitans are not paying me. And the Sultan then goes and says, go investigate this and make sure they're paying to the Patriarch. It shows that the Patriarch can't even control his own metropolitans. It's a very shocking moment. And so, the other example, this is kind of an example of Patriarch Jeremiah. There's an account I found in the Ottoman documents. He's going down to into Greece, and he is kind of coming into one of the cities, and he's going to collect the dues himself, and he's attacked by the villagers. The people come out with kind of axes and implements, and they chase him. And he's only because, and he's accompanied by janissaries, right? So here's an image, it's a later image. And it's a gendarme, like the Ottoman policeman, basically stops them. And then they get thrown, they're punished. The villagers that attack end up rowing for the Ottoman Navy, like an eternal punishment. Right? They are thrown into to be rowers. These are coming out of the Ottoman archives, all these stories that I'm telling. So when we look at this, we're like, oh my gosh, this is really a very challenging time. Now, interesting, at the same time, the Protestants in Germany end up coming down to talk to had their Reformation, and they want an ally against the Catholics, so they come and talk to the Patriarchate. In 1570, they conquer Cyprus, and that opens up a new world for the Patriarchate, because now they have a new land, a new territory that was previously under Venetian rule, and they can actually assert themselves as a Patriarchate. Even though it's an autocephalous church on its own, they installed the first Orthodox Archbishop of Cyprus after the Venetians are thrown out. So it becomes a bit contentious. And of course, in that same period is when the Patriarchate of Moscow is established. And this is actually a bit of a difficult story because when it comes to this question of autocephaly, Patriarch Jeremiah II, around 1588 and 89, he is traveling to raise funds. They're always in search of funds because they need to make these payments. So he goes to Moscow because they're Orthodox by this time, but he's kind of sequestered for 2 years. He falls sick, but then he's kind of kept as a prisoner in a sense by the Tsar, and he is kind of, in a sense, forced to sign an autocephaly, and he goes back and says, okay, and he gets it approved by the Synod at Constantinople. So it's this kind of strange relationship. Moscow gets its autocephaly as a patriarchate through strong-arming Jeremiah. So it's the story hasn't changed, right? Is it? Okay. So here we go. I'm not going to make those kind of editorial comments. You guys can do that for me. Okay, how do we consolidate authority? Now, one of the issues about consolidating authority, this is kind of an important figure. It's a Cretan figure, Kyrios Lugax, Cyril Lugax. He he serves as patriarch in the early 1600s, and he had been trained in Europe, had been influenced by the Protestants. And he saw that there was kind of this larger Protestant Catholic thing going on, and he was sympathetic to the Protestants. In fact, some people will call him the Protestant Patriarch because he signs a confession of faith in agreement, let's say, with some of the Protestant theologians. But he is clearly Orthodox, and he's kind of misnamed that. But what we find is that during his reign, it's the Catholics who are trying to make inroads into the Middle East. And not only that, it is Protestants. Ultimately, the ultimately, the Catholic Jesuits do him in. They tell the Sultan he has to, they want him dead. And they ultimately execute him and throw him into the Bosphorus. So Cyril is one of these important figures. What's that? I don't remember the exact Sultan that did him in. Now, the conquest of Crete is a long period, but the final kind of experience when they conquer is around 1669. And this, again, is one of those important moments for the Patriarchate. Cyprus had come under the Ottoman rule, so they now have access to Cyprus. When the Ottomans take over Crete, the Venetians, who had controlled many of the churches, and the monks of Mount Sinai had controlled many of the churches, the Patriarchate kind of extends itself here. So it's advancing the patriarchal kind of authority into these, after these conquests. Now, I'm going to these are examples of documents of the same period. It's called the Episcopos Matheos Kalemi. It's basically the patriarchal rents, the concession that we're talking about. So as late as the 1660s, we have examples where patriarchs are borrowing money to pay their fees from, in one case, it is a military commander, El-Hajj Qasim Allah bin Abdul Menan, borrowing from a Muslim. Not only that, but a military man. A second case is that Patriarch Dionysius borrowed money from an Islamic pious foundation, a Waqf, of the Sultan Ahmed religious school, from a madrasa. They're borrowing money to pay their dues from Muslim institutions. Shocking, right? So I'm like, where does this end? Right? And I'm trying to think about this. And so one of the places I started thinking about is the transition from this weakness to an event that happens in 1697. I'm not going to read all that, but I'll tell you in brief the story. In 1697, there was a former Archbishop of Thessaloniki. His name was Matheos. He was defrocked. We don't know the exact reason, but he goes to the Sultan directly and he says, give me the authority as Patriarch, and I will give you an investiture that you've never seen before, and I will run your institution for you. And not only that, I'll run the Patriarch of Antioch, I'll run the Patriarch of Jerusalem, I'll run the Patriarch of Alexandria. He wants a whole shooting match, right? And so the Sultan's like, this sounds like a good deal. And so when it comes to it, the Patriarchate hears about this, and they respond, and they realize that they have to respond on that same level. So he calls all of the patriarchs together, he gets the resources of the lay people at the time, and they talk about it, and they give it a thing. He calls them the disciples of Satan, right? And some of them, they're finding the right to sell and purchase state patents for hierarchical positions. They call it Malikiane, which is another institution similar to what I've been saying. And so with all of this, they raise enough money to fight that off. They're successful. And so I see this as a turning point, 1697. Because it's after this that we begin to see fewer and fewer cases of these strange borrowings of money and the financial institution. And something else that's happening around the same time is the growth and strength of what we call the fanariotes, a group of lay people who live in and around the Patriarchate who decide they're going to support the Patriarchate financially and be their protectors. And so we know in the 1700s, they become very powerful. They even take on positions in the Ottoman, for the Ottoman Sultan as translators or ambassadors, roughly. And so we have this story. So by 1798, there are a whole series of rights and privileges that they have, but They have law courts with penal jurisdiction. They're responsible for the orderly and loyal behavior of the flock, and to ensure that taxes are paid. The Patriarchate by the 1790s had become a very powerful institution, not just over the bishops now, because they can throw bishops in jail on their own if they're not going to cooperate. But they are also now in charge of the community more broadly, or at least they have more authority to represent that. There's an additional kind of, this is always a complicated story, and I'll just say it quickly. Their power grew very strong for a period of time, and in order to counteract that, they set up the system of hierarchismos. This is a seal, and every patriarchal document needed to be stamped with the seal. In order to counteract the power of one fanariote kind of layman who supports one patriarch, they said, this seal is going to be given to 4 metropolitans. Patriarch's just one of them, 1 and 3 others. And you can't get a decision without all 4 people stamping it. So that's a way to counteract the over kind of the authority. It's also a period that some of you know, St. Hippolytos Agioides, who writes the important hesychastic, the spiritual documents, the Philokalia, things. He also publishes the lives of the neo-martyrs and the saints. So it's a period of kind of renewed emphasis on the tradition of the church. It's a period where they found an Athonite academy by Patriarch Cyril V in 1749, an institution on Mount Athos for training the higher clergy. It's a period where a person like Eugenius Vulgaris, who's an intellectual giant, he becomes the director of that academy, but also of the Patriarchal Academy, and so he's publishing, he's part of this Enlightenment movement. And I also wanted to say, I just finished a paper on the Patriarch's educational program. We think about the Krifos Golyok, and I'm sorry to tell you, it's a mythic story. Because when I looked at just 2 patriarchs, the 2 preceding the revolution, which I was interested in, Patriarch Genius VI and Gregory V, there were 47 decrees about education between the 2 of them. And 13 were about giving authority to found schools all over, from Asia Minor, from Santorini and Paros, in Athens. They're calling for financial support for schools. The Patriarch is actually giving monasteries to a school to fund it. Imagine that. They're giving the whole monastery because the monasteries have income, a place to teach, there's teachers, but also the income from the school to pay these people. And then, of course, there are administrative things, and there was a major dispute. So these were kind of, just in 2 reigns, 47 about schools in the Ottoman period. They were unafraid, they were openly doing this. And so education, perhaps in some areas, depending on certain pashas, might have been limited, but it was still a real possibility. And so we're in the last stage, and I'm begging your indulgence for a few more minutes. We know the last stage happens in 1821. Those of us, you know, we thought about it during the anniversary, the 200 anniversary. We know, of course, the price that was paid by Patriarch Gregory V. He was hung and at the gates, and of course the gates of the Patriarchate have been closed ever since in commemoration. Interesting, because Gregory, in many ways, was very much, he was from Dimitsana, which is in the southern Peloponnese, and because of that, it's believed that that's why he was associated with, and they wanted to kill him. He represented the Orthodox, it was a punishment, but also he was sympathetic. But previously, the Patriarchate had written a letter to the entire people, an encyclical that we all know about. It says, revolutionaries, they're calling them, tied to atheism from Europe. Part of this progressive atheism. The Patriarchate didn't like that. And so they were trying to tell the people, God ordained the empire to be as it is. Let's not be revolutionaries. Now, this document is out there. It's not clear. I still think Gregory is very much a revolutionary. And part of his vision, of course, was his educational program. And setting up these schools was very much about Greek identity. He thought about Greek and Hellenic identity, language, as well as his faith as important. So, kind of interesting story about Gregory, more to be said about him, I think. But it's also a period where you begin to see the dismantling of territory that ceases to be Ottoman. And we know that after the Greek Revolution, the Church of Greece petitions, kind of one-sided. They demand, they pronounce themselves as autocephalous. Right? And it takes until 1850 that they're finally recognized. Churches like the Bulgarian Exarchate, which is all the Bulgarian lands, they petition to the Sultan. We don't want the Greek Patriarch to be our bishop. We want a Bulgarian Patriarch to be our bishop. So the Sultan complies in 1870. And this becomes a problem for the Patriarchate. They lose authority over those people. It doesn't get solved until after World War II, when it's normalized that this whole thing happens. The Church of Romania, right? The Church of Serbia and the Church of Albania are similar. They start to fall apart. So, in fact, being under the Ottoman Empire meant the Patriarchate had direct access to them. Now that they're independent national states, they are no longer in the direct jurisdiction. And so they are petitioning for independence to be their own independent patriarchates. There's another thing I'm going to kind of go through. There's some, well, the era in the 1850s, an era of reforms that changes the relationship between the church and the state. It ceases to ask for these dues that I talked about. In fact, it says here, the ecclesiastical dues of whatever sort and nature they shall be abolished. And in turn, there'll be fixed revenues that they do have to give. So it changes the format. And then it says that from now on, right, the temporal administration of Christian or other non-Muslims shall be placed under the safeguard of an assembly of both ecclesiastics and laymen. And this brings on something called the National Mixed Council. So from 1860 onward, the Patriarchate then is governed by a mixed group of clergy and laity, which means the two diosoma ecclesias, right? Two bodies of the church. The Holy Synod is one of the bodies. And the second one is a permanent national mixed council, the Archons of Tampa Bay, which includes 4 senior bishops, but 8 lay people elected from the cosmopolitan Greek community. So in 1860, the Patriarchate was governed by clergy and laity in a mixed council. And I'm just going to gloss over it. So towards the end of this century, a person like Joachim III rises. He is trying to promote the interests of the Patriarchate, and at one point he's trying to establish schools and the independence of the church, and ultimately he is, let's see, he's forced to resign because he is trying to assert the power of and authority of the Patriarchate to the state. The reforms of 1850 and 60 have been reducing the power. And so he's now trying to fight against that, and he ends up being forced to resign. Now we enter the 20th century. This period of 1908 is consequential because it changes the, it's a period where there are certain constitutional reforms that take place that impact the Turkish, or the Ottoman state, but also the Patriarchate. In 1912 and 13, we know about the Balkan Wars. This radicalizes, before they're called the Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, the people who have this, they want to reestablish a constitution. But in a short time, they become supercharged Turkish nationalists. And the result of this, I mean, the reason is because the Balkan Wars have just chopped off. This is like the Kakidiki, kind of northern Greece, Macedonia, Thraci, right? This has all been chopped off and taken by the Greek state, Serbia, and Bulgaria from the Ottomans. So from that moment, the Ottomans are like, they've been radicalized. They're Turkish nationalists to the extent they don't want to hear anything about any ethnicity or any minority. And so as a result, in 1914, we see, we have evidence of people being displaced, expulsions, massacres, rapes, and burning of villages in the Pontos. This is a precursor to, the World War I breaks out, and it's a precursor to the Armenian genocide. So the Pontian genocide precedes the Armenian genocide. It's part of the same story, but since World War I broke out, the Armenians became more of a threat because they were supported by the Russians more directly. And so we know that they are also expelled, over 1 million people murdered within this short period of time. Now, this is Metropolitan Dorotheos of Brusa. He's the predecessor, immediate predecessor, when Archbishop Obiloforos was Bishop of Brusa. This was the bishop before. It hadn't been filled since Obiloforos became. For a period of time, around 1919, he becomes the acting patriarch, locum tenens it's called, as Metropolitan. He realized that what was going on with the Pontians, and then there were other things going on. There were attacks, there was a major boycott against the Greek Orthodox businesses and community, and there were even massacres. And so as the Ottomans were on the wrong side, the losing side of the World War I, they go to the Paris peace talks, and Dorotheos goes too. And what he wants to do is draw attention to the sufferings inflicted by the Turks on the Greek populations in the Turkish Empire. And they produced this interesting book. It's called the Mavri Vivros Geomonke Martyrion du en Turkia Anismo, the persecution of the Greeks in Turkey. And in this, it describes in great detail what they ask, the Patriarchate is asking, because they know the Paris peace talks are going on. They want evidence of these misdeeds. So they begin to write to all the bishops and all the localities, saying, please tell us in great detail anything that has gone bad, any sort of murder, any sort of abuse. And so for a certain time, they thought that these things, and so they describe the violent acts, and he says, threatened by this peril, the Patriarchate now makes a desperate appeal to the great powers, demanding their protection and intervention in the name of humanity. In that of civilization and justice, in the name of the many treaties, whereby the existence of Christians in the East has been guaranteed, beseeching them to prevent the accomplishment of that which centuries of tyranny would never dare to dream. She therefore devotes whatever force she still possesses to implore the support of the great powers in favor of the remnants of Christianity in the East, and begs them to mediate the application of reforms in Turkey and Asia Minor with the Ottoman government. So this is kind of at the Paris peace talks. The Greek invasion, the Greek army shows up in Smyrna. It's encouraged by the great powers in its way even to set them up. But of course it ends in humiliating defeat and the burning of the city. And so we know that at the end result of this is the Treaty of Lausanne. And the Treaty of Lausanne has a number of stipulations, which includes a population exchange. It sets the boundaries, 1.3 million Greek Orthodox that are from the Ottoman lands are forcibly moved to Greece, and about 350,000 Muslims are forcibly moved to Turkey. But in that, there's no mention of the Patriarchate. He's not in the Treaty of Lausanne at all. I mean, these are 1.5 million. The, of course, exception is that the Greek community of Constantinople and Ingros and Tenedos, which amounts to about 200,000 people, and then there are about 350,000 Muslims, 120,000 Muslims in Eastern Thrace, a community that's still there today. So, what we see is, we thought that the other one was the greatest existential crisis. In fact, it was. But once again, we have another situation. It had been territorial loss has dismantled the empire. The great catastrophe and the Trinity gets rid of their immediate membership of their churches. And of course, following that, there's a restricted policy of restricted isolation targeting the Greek Orthodox community. Not seeing him as an ecumenical patriarch, but seeing him as just a bishop of Islam. And so, of course, in response to that, these are my last couple words. One of the strategies, of course, of the Patriarchate of the 20th century has been to reaffirm its pan-Orthodox unity in a globalized context, to initiate dialogue for Christian unity, it comes up with solutions. It utilizes the Church of America, the Church of Crete, the Church of Australia as part of its operations in order to get human capital as well as financial support. And it kind of dwells on this global Greek Orthodox diaspora. And so my final comment is, His All Holiness Patriarch Bartholomew has exercised the prerogatives of the ecumenical patriarch to lead, mediate, and coordinate the Orthodox around the globe in pursuit of Christian unity and universal values. By emphasizing his positions of ecumenical and transnational bearing, he has raised the status of the Patriarchate again onto the world stage. And so that's the
my understanding that although the Patriarchate is not directly referenced in the Treaty of Lausanne, there was quite extensive discussions within the group about the Patriarchate, and Venizelos, who was Prime Minister of Christendom, insisted in keeping the Patriarchate. That was one of the red lines that he had. And can you elaborate on that?
Sure. In fact, he did have that position, and that was definitely the Greek position. From the Turkish side, the negotiators were dead set against it. And the person who made it happen and was there, really, was Lord Curzon, who was the British negotiator. He insisted. He saw that this was if that had left, it would be a major tragedy for Christianity, for the world, in a sense. So if it weren't for him and his insistence, and then the Turkish negotiators backed off as a result of that.
You mentioned that once the government changed, and really has the democracy
So I'm not sure what happens in the Turkish Republic, so I don't know that answer. It changes form in the 1850s. And so it ceases to be this kind of random, anytime another person wants to become patriarch, they offer a higher amount. That kind of ends by 1850, and it's just a standard fee. So I'm pretty sure, I'm going to say I don't know, because that's the truth. Yes?
I just want to know, after Fort Clayton closed, schools, monastery, everything was set.
So the question was, why was Talpi closed? And so it's interesting, the Patriarchal Academy is an important institution. And some people say that Patriarch Matheos reestablished it. It's very hard to tell in that early period. We know in the early 1600s is when it really was established as a patriarchal academy. The school of Halki, as we know it, is fairly, in the course of history, recent, 1850s. And that's when it's kind of fully established. It's the monastery of Papademetriou. Now you're asking about something that happens in the Turkish Republican era. The answer, so it's not the Ottoman that do this. The Ottomans allow it to function. In this case, there was a law that was passed that did not want foreign, quotes, air quotes, foreign schools functioning. They wanted all educational institutions to come under the ministry of the state. The Patriarchate did not want that for its theological school. It allowed the school to function afterwards as a high school. So it continued as a high school into the, I think the early 80s, no, mid-70s. So, but the theological wing of it was shut down. But that's because they didn't want, let's say in Greece, if you know the American College of Greece, it's not recognized by the Greek government. People can go there, its charter is in the United States. But the Greek government, you can't necessarily go from that and go into work for the government agency having an American college, unless you have a master's. But anyway, but that's the reason. They don't want foreign, and they considered the Rum community foreigners. They call them Yabanji. You know, this is the picture. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Appreciate it very much. What a great presentation. It really enlightens us, especially those of us who have been working for the Patriarchate, because a lot of the things that happened in the past seem to be happening again. You could argue that we're now at the Ecumenical Patriarchate's third existential crisis. From the 200,000 Greeks that were allowed to stay in Constantinople and the two islands at 1923, we now have less than 2,000, and most of them are over the age of 60. Whereas the 120,000 Muslims in Thrace have now grown to 400,000. So which government has been a little bit more tolerant of their minorities? From the 8,000 properties that the Patriarchate owned in 1923 that were registered sometime in the 1930s, we have less than 500. Why? Because they confiscated them as they fell into disrepair and they wouldn't issue permits, or the foundations, which go back to the Ottoman times, were not allowed to be refilled, or people were intimidated, and before you know it, no foundation, no property, you know, and they take the property away. So the income went away, and we were so dirt poor that, and they wouldn't even give us a permit to fix our own Patriarchate from, like you said, the 1940s until Jimmy Carter intervened in the 70s to allow that to happen. But now the Archons have established a foundation, but basically it's a endowment fund, that's the word, thank you. The Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew Endowment Fund, so that he can be financially independent and not have to go around and beg, or rely on the Greek government, which can change, or rely just on whatever the contributions are annually from America and Australia, whatever. And I think we're up to what, $27 million already? $22 million. And two of our Archons, Mark Lagos and Joko Balakis, are responsible for recruiting new members for this fund. But already we've got 22 million in pledges, and our goal is 100 million, so that that institution can survive and do what it needs to in Turkey, which probably still means paying some hidden taxes, as you will, because that's the way business is done over there. I've lived there. You don't get anything done if you don't put an envelope in the right hand. And that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. So, the Turkish government's not getting this money. This will be completely separate from any governmental interference. It's based in the United States, I believe, charged in the United States. It'll be safe. The Turkish government cannot touch the funds in the endowment fund. Now, the income that comes from that and what the patriarch does with it, either by necessity, by force, or whatever, eventually, we can't say. But at least he'll be able to meet his obligations and survive. Because again, that's how you survive in that kind of environment. I want to thank Tom again for a brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. I want to thank our apprentices, our wonderful wives, and others for preparing some nice refreshments for you. Okay. Father will bless them, and then yes. Before that, we have a special presentation from one of our Archons, Mr. Matheos, for our speaker.
Okay, you invited us with considerable wisdom, and we certainly appreciate that for a period that we, all of us, individually and collectively, know a little about. Myself, I'm amazed as to how the Patriarchate managed to survive through those years by paying tax, by paying bribes, but they paid whatever was necessary for them to survive. And they did that. And even though we complain that they are under siege, they exist, they thrive, and hopefully better days are ahead of us. In appreciation of this, we would like to offer you the Archons of Tampa Bay, a small gift. It's not a backstage, it's a plain gift because we appreciate it and we would like you to have it. It consists of two books that are related to our discussion tonight. One is The Greeks in the National Uprising of 1821, that was written by a bunch of academics. I had the pleasure to write the Cretan participation as a chapter here. And another book that was also very apropos here, it's about the story and the adventurous life of Eleftherios Venizelos, and we know how instrumental he was in keeping the Patriarchate as we discussed. And lastly, a little more earthly, I would like you to have this.
Oh, beautiful.
This is made out of, but more importantly, it's made out of black walnut and very hard wood, and hopefully it will last for years.
A Cretan needed to do this.
That's right. Enjoy.
I feel like I have to raise it and kiss it, you know? So thank you. Thank you. I haven't seen it. And it was just like
Well, we have some beautiful refreshments and delectables over here. We got pistachio cake, kebab, pax malaika, pururakia, cheese, grapes, all beautiful things from Our Ladies. We thank Our Ladies in the hospitality group, and again we thank our Archons and Dr. Tipolakos for this beautiful presentation, and thank you, Tom. As I saw the icon of St. Gregory Palamas, I had a flashback of your dad. He used to teach that course.
Yes.
Let's all rise for prayer. Christ our God, bless the food and drink of these thy servants, and bless the hands that prepared it, and multiply it in the homes of your servants throughout the world, for you are holy, always, now and forever, to the age of ages. Amen. God bless you all.